What did he do to make this house so evil?
Civil, whoops. Civil asset forfeiture is a highly controversial and misunderstood U.S. federal law that allows law enforcement to seize private property without leveraging any crimes against the person who owns the property. Researchers and advocates describe the predation of civil forfeiture, which often ensnares completely innocent people, causing them economic hardship, emotional distress, and the denial of their constitutional rights. Though it was originally designed to combat organized crime and large enterprises, many average people have found themselves tangled up in legal technicalities to regain the property that is rightfully theirs. Examples of civil forfeiture misuse range from isolated events to systemic operations that intentionally scheme for profit. Robert Stilson of Capital Research Center published a poignant article in 2020 wherein he scrutinizes systemic misuse of civil asset forfeiture in Detroit, where law enforcement routinely seized vehicles from owners on extremely thin pretexts without presenting any charges and then required payments of $1,000 for the owners to recover their property. The regime is now challenged by mass litigation as lawyers seek to uphold the constitutional rights of those impacted, as well as seek restitution for related damages. Individual instances of misuse of this law include a mother's car being seized after her son sold materials from the car without her knowledge. And in another case, a man was pressured to sign away nearly $92,000 in cash to the state of Wyoming during a routine traffic stop. He was later required to prove in court that he had earned the money lawfully. These examples construct an image that is the antithesis of our criminal justice system's cornerstone, where innocent until proven guilty becomes guilty until proven innocent. Except what these people are guilty of is often not specified. How can a lawyer protect your legal and personal rights if police are not required to leverage charges against you? It's not a crime to carry a large amount of cash on your person. And yet, law enforcement in Wyoming used this broad federal law to seize a man's earnings until he proved they had been earned legally. This highlights how any person at any time could find themselves impacted by this questionable, albeit lawful, process. A truly horrific example of sustained misuse of asset forfeiture hails from Philadelphia, where police and prosecutors operated a draconian civil forfeiture machine that took in over $72 million from 2002 to 2014. In addition to cash, the city pursued forfeiture against over 3,500 automobiles and over 1,200 homes or other real property. In many cases, the property owners were never charged with crimes, yet to challenge these forfeitures, they were required to appear at 5 separate hearings on average that were overseen by a prosecutor, so not even a judge. Any decisions made by the prosecutors were not eligible for appeal. This was a clear and sustained violation of due process, where more than 35% of the subsequent proceeds had been spent on salaries of the exact officials doing the seizing and forfeiting. Following a major class action settlement in 2018, the city of Philadelphia agreed to dismantle its civil forfeiture apparatus through a series of reforms, and they further financially compensated those affected by the scheme. Since 2014, the Institute of Justice has noted that 35 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have passed some level of asset forfeiture reform. In 2019, Congress passed the Clyde Hirsch Sowers Respect Act, which limits how the IRS can use civil forfeiture to seize assets from bank accounts. Additionally, two key pieces of legislation have surfaced addressing looming concerns. One is the Fifth Amendment Integrity Act, also known as FAIR Act, passed by H.R. 1895, and the Due Process Act, passed by H.R. 2835. Both outline a substantial overhaul of federal civil forfeiture by raising the standard of proof and clearing evidence and shifting the burden of proof onto the government rather than the property owners. The FAIR Act also abolished the Equitable Sharing Program, which, according to the Department of Justice, was an initiative that allowed law enforcement agencies to receive a share of the proceeds from assets seized during substance-related investigations. The program aimed to support local and state law enforcement by redistributing funds that were generated from the forfeiture of assets linked to illegal substance activities. And you can see how this easily becomes a problem. And I'm going to use the example that I just referenced earlier with the man in Wyoming who was carrying a large amount of cash on his person. Those police officers under the Equitable Sharing Program may have had a vested interest in trying to prove that the funds were not acquired legally, or at least claiming they were, and then they shifted that burden of proof onto the person. They didn't come to him with a warrant and say, "We are accusing you of selling stolen auto parts," or something like that. They did not find any evidence of wrongdoing on this person. He simply had a large amount of cash on him. And then they used this initiative to say, "Hey, well, how did you get all of this cash?" And, then he was probably forced to bring up all of his tax documents, his W-2s, and everything to prove that he had not committed a crime, an unspecified crime, which is a huge problem because normally in the justice system and every other instance, when someone is accused of a crime, there's an element called probable cause. And there was no probable cause on this person to insinuate that a crime had been accomplished. It was simply that he had a large amount of money, which, as you can see, that's not enough proof of a crime. That is not probable cause. However, the way that the Equitable Sharing Program and civil asset forfeiture legislature has been written, these police officers were able to bend the law to say that it was essentially probable cause. I have many thoughts on this. However, most interesting to me is the sanitized language, which I find so curious and a little bit silly. It's giving unlawful search and seizure. In case you don't know or need reminding, the Fourth Amendment protects U.S. citizens from unlawful searches and seizures. Secondly, the Equitable Sharing Program sounds like it has nothing to do with the subject matter. And it's always entertaining to read the verbiage and this vernacular used in these legislative documents because they're so carefully written to be unassuming or even a little misleading. And they sometimes obscure the true intentions behind the policies using legal jargon that makes it difficult for the average person to discern the line between lawful and unlawful conduct. The National Literacy Institute reported the following in 2025. On average, 79% of U.S. adults nationwide are literate in 2024. 21% of adults in the U.S. are literate in 2024. 54% of adults have a literacy below a sixth grade reading level, and 20% are below a fifth grade reading level. Low levels of literacy cost the U.S. up to $2.2 trillion per year. Massachusetts was the state with the highest rate of child literacy, while New Mexico was the state with the lowest child literacy. New Hampshire was the state with the highest percentage of adults considered literate. The state with the lowest adult literacy rate was in California. When measured globally, the US ranks 36th in literacy overall. Even more concerning are two data points that stuck out to me from this institute's research collected in 2022 and 2023. In this slightly older study, they explain that 20% of Americans read below the level needed to earn a living wage. 50% of the unemployed between the ages of 16 and 21 cannot read well enough to be considered functionally literate. Between 46% and 51% of American adults have an income well below the poverty level because of their inability to read. The Institute further examined the relationship between poverty and literacy, stating that their research suggests a direct correlation between poverty and illiteracy. I was surprised to see that illiteracy has such a high financial cost for our country, but perhaps the greater cost here is the disparity between socioeconomic classes. I want this to inform you and encourage you to become as literate as possible. It has arguably never been more important to be literate than it is right now. I know it's casual to make jokes about brain rot and AI dependency, but I'm here to tell you that if we don't take this problem seriously, then circumstances will only become bleaker. And if you've been on the internet at all over the past couple of months, you've probably seen all of the TikToks discussing teachers leaving education en masse. And a lot of that is due to exactly this problem right here, the fact that children are not disciplined. Children do not have sufficient attention spans to focus in the classroom. And this problem extends far beyond the classroom, which it's already unfortunate enough that um, children are so impacted by this. But going back to the data points I provided from the NLI from 2022 and 2023, the ones that discussed how literacy impacted one's ability to earn money, it's very concerning. In fact, in 2023, Ballotpedia reported that nationwide ballot language was written at a third year graduate school reading level. That's far beyond a sixth grade reading level, which about half of the US can read at. Ballotpedia further assigned a readability score of 19 using the Flesch Reading Ease and the Flesch Kincaid grade level. But as I said, this extends far beyond ballots, which is concerning enough because the average US adult does not possess the reading comprehension required to understand these bills. Likewise, the average US adult does not possess the reading comprehension to understand an elaborate federal law that can be weaponized to trample on their constitutional rights. And the darkest part about this is that those lacking the minimum reading comprehension also lack the funds to retain a lawyer to protect their legal rights. And the data I've just provided substantiates that fact. In this episode, I do have a call to action, and that is to simply pick up a book. If you have children, nieces, nephews, cousins, read to them because the education crisis we have been experiencing here in the US doesn't appear to be self-limiting. It's not something that's going to improve as technology advances and we start leaning more into AI and becoming more dependent on it. If you are a college student, don't use AI to do your homework. Use your brain. A wonderful free resource for any college student to use is called Purdue OWL. I use that all the time to format my papers according to APA format or sometimes even MLA format. Like I said, it's a free resource. There is a paid version of it, but if you're okay with watching a couple of short ads, then it's a wonderful resource to help you write your papers, to help you understand what format to use, how to gather your resource list correctly, and make sure that it's formatted correctly. And lastly, I want to know, how does this information sit with you? Were you aware of asset forfeiture? I was unaware that this federal law existed until I began doing research for this docuseries. Since we just had an election, I'm curious to know how many of us felt like we understood the scope of the bills being voted on. I skip over anything I don't understand on a ballot. It seems like the reasonable thing to do. It's important to vote, but we also must understand what we are voting for. As some may agree, I take issue with how long these bills can get. It would be easier for average citizens if bills were limited to one issue rather than being packed with hundreds of pages of concerns and solutions. Here is a bill tracking website if you're interested in learning about upcoming bills. The site provides options to write or call Congress with your concerns. I've provided the link for you in the description as well. You can refer to your state's .gov website for information regarding state matters. Thank you so much for tuning back in to SOS.